So as you take a look at doing this problem, think of order of operations. And we're still following the same order of operations. But the question usually comes up then, what is the square root? Where does the square root fall in that order of operations? Well, first of all, remember what a square root means? A square root basically means what number squared equals that? So like in this kind of a case, if we simplify that stuff inside, the 9 minus 6, that gives us 3. Square root of 3 is saying what number times itself, that is, what number squared, equals 3. Hence, square root. Because it has to do with squaring it, it goes in the same category as the exponent. So whenever you see square root, treat it as an exponent. And in fact, as you'll learn in Algebra 2, it actually is an exponent. We can actually write it as the 1/2 power if you really want to bend your brain a little bit right now. And so this is what we're doing here. That means that I got to do the stuff that's inside of the square root first, almost like there's parentheses sitting in there. And so I do the 9 minus 6 first to get the 3, and then I do the square root of 3. Now for the square root of 3 then, you got to break out the calculator, right? Now, at the start of class, I had you get out a scientific calculator that you can use on a test or a quiz, because I want to make sure that you know how to do this. If you have a graphing calculator, yes, you can use that as well. You'll just type it in as you see it. But everything I talk about will be about how we use the scientific. In terms of using a scientific calculator, what you'll press here is you'll press the 3 button, and then you'll press the square root button after that. So you type the number that you want to take the square root of, and then you press the square root button. When you do that then, it gives you a big long decimal. And when we do that, we end up getting 1.732, and it's this big long decimal that goes on forever. Now this particular problem told us to round to the 100th place. How many decimal places is that? 2. And so if I'm going to round to 2 decimal places, then my answer ends up being 1.73. Because you'll notice here as we take a look at this, that this 2 does not change the 3. It leaves it alone. And so that's my final answer, 1.73. This is the point at which normally things start getting a little bit trickier, because most people look at this problem and say, yeah, it's super easy. And then they get it wrong. Okay? And so we wanted to address what's actually happening with this problem. Now I'm going to start by telling you what the correct answer should be. We should be getting an answer of negative 1.66. And suddenly, a number of people are going, wait, how could that be, right? So let's take a look at how we go about doing this. First of all, remember that the square root goes in the order of operations like an exponent does. So in terms of actually figuring out what this whole thing equals, the very first thing to do is the square root. So we're going to do the square root of 3 first. So that's going to give me 7 minus 5. What operation is going on between the 5 and the root 3? Multiplication. And so it's going to be 5 times the square root of 3, which conveniently enough is what we just calculated in the last problem. That's that 1.73 and so on number. Now this is, for many of us, the critical learning point of the day. I can write down 1.73 on my paper, but if I continue just using 1.73, so if I then multiply that by 5, which is going to be the next thing we do, and then I do 7 minus that number, then it ends up giving me potentially the incorrect value, because we end up getting rounding error in there. If we did that, it would actually give us negative 1.65. Which doesn't look like a big difference, but it's wrong, right? And as we're going to be seeing in some more problems, that little bit of rounding error that just got created can actually become big. And it can actually get to be big differences in numbers, depending on how we do it. So the way around it is that on your calculator, you just did the square root of 3. So that's the number that's sitting on your calculator. Once we've done that, do that on your calculator again, if you don't already have that number sitting on your screen. The square root of 3, so it displays the whole decimal sitting there. The next thing I need to do, order of operations wise, is multiply that by 5. And so since that number is already sitting on your screen, just press times 5. doing it with the entire decimal. Now when you do that, you should be getting an answer of 8.6602544038. It's another one of those decimals that goes on and on and on. Keep that entire decimal showing on your calculator, okay? Don't clear it. Now, again, how we got there. We did the square root of 3 to get this decimal sitting on your calculator. While that is still displayed on your calculator screen, press times 5 and then press equals. And it will give you that long decimal there. So the next thing we got to do now is do 7 minus that 8.66 number. But again, I don't want to do 7 minus and then type in 8.66. I can get some rounding error in there if I do it that way. And that can create some problems. And so instead, we need to be able to keep that entire 8.660254, etc. number on our calculator screen and operate on that. So we need to be smarter than our calculators here. Because 7 minus 8.66, isn't that the same as a negative 8.66 plus 7? And so why would we do that? Because on your calculator now, press that little button that looks like a plus minus. You're now looking at negative 8.66 and so on and so on.
I have 1.6.
Once you've gotten that negative 8.66, you then do the plus of 7. That's how we get the negative 1.66 at the end. That way you're not having to remember the stuff as you go along, and you can actually use the number that your calculator is giving you. And that's what I want you to be able to do. Now we've got to practice this idea again, right? So let's have to take a look at another problem. All right, so we need to, in this case, do the stuff that's inside of the square root first. And so that means the 3 plus the 2 times the 4. Which part of that do I do first? The 3 plus 2 or the 2 times 4?
2 times 4.
2 times 4, absolutely, because order of operations, multiplication first. Write out your work, just like we've been doing with all those solving equations and evaluating things. Write out what that gives you at each step along the way. Now I can do the 3 plus 8, so that gives me 11. So now we have 9 root 11. So how do we calculate that then? We do the square root first, right?
Yes.
Yep. And so do the square root of 11. Now when we do that, so the square root of 11 ends up being 3.3166247, and it's this decimal that just goes on forever, right? Now, if right now you just rounded that to 3.32 and multiplied it by 9, you get the wrong answer. Instead, leave that number sitting on your screen and then just say times 9. It's not only faster and it saves you more typing, but it also is more accurate. So when we do that, it gives us 29.8496. And again, it's one of these decimals that goes on forever. Now round it to the hundreds. 29.85 is your final answer. All right, so for this one, again, we have to do the stuff inside the square root first. So that means I'm going to do 1 plus 9 times 4 in there. Now, what do I do first? 1 plus 9 or 9 times 4? We got to do the 9 times 4 first, right? The order of operations. And some of you are sitting there going, yeah, I know, we've talked about this, but we still tend to make the same mistakes. In fact, I saw some people making that same mistake of trying to add first here. So it's not just repetition. So we end up doing 1 plus the 9 times 4, which is 36. Everything else is just carrying through. Now I can do the 1 plus the 36. So that's going to give me 37. Now we need to take the square root of 37. And again, leave the number sitting up on your calculator when you do this, because it gives you about 6.08, and it's this big long decimal that keeps on going. I'm just writing down 6.08 on my paper so that I can keep track of what that number was. But I'm still using the number that's showing on my calculator right now. That big, long, ugly thing. Once I have that, then on your calculator, you press the squared button. It'll actually usually show up on the calculator as x squared. And when you press that, it should give you 37. Now, why does it give us the exact same thing out? Because remember what square root means. Square root means what number times itself, that is, what number squared, will equal this. So, what number squared equals 37? 6.08, which when squared gives us 37. It's actually because square roots and squares undo each other. It's a cool little trick. It's actually one we'll be using more later this year, too. All right. All right, for this one, notice what we have going on here. We have parentheses and we have an exponent in there. So I got to do the stuff that's inside of the parentheses first. So I'm going to start by doing the 4 plus root 7. Now, I'm not going to do that in one step. I got to do the square root of 7 first. So this is going to become 4 plus, and then in my calculator I go 7, press the square root button, and we get an answer of 2.6475. It's this big, long, ugly decimal. Okay? And so I'm just going to write down 2.64 on my paper, but I know that's rounded. I'm not going to just use that exact decimal again. I'm leaving the one in the calculator so I can use that. So the next thing I do is I'm going to do 4 plus that number. Well, of course, that number plus 4 is the same as 4 plus that. So on my calculator, I can just say plus 4 and get 6.64575131 and so on out of the calculator. And now I still have that big long decimal showing in my calculator. So this is now when you press the squared button. And so then when you press the squared button on this one, when we square that, we get 44.16601 and so on. Remember, your final answer still needs to be rounded to the 100th. So our final answer then is 44.17. Now, on these problems, we were just rounding to the 100th. Your homework is going to have it varying what you round to. So you're still going to have to pay attention to what does that particular problem ask you to round to. So be looking out for that as you do the homework.